Hey guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and this is the introductory video of our Minorities in Children's and YA Lit class. And so the purpose of this first video is just to give you guys a little bit of a background. I am not assuming that most of you have taken my Children's Lit class, which is sort of the history of Children's Lit and all through and up until today. Maybe a couple of you have taken it before, and some of you might be in it right now. And so some of this will be a little bit of a repeat for that, but not all of it. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background about the history of the field of children's literature and how children have been studied throughout the years and how what they read has been affected by different ideas of childhood. And specifically also I want to talk about the institution of the children's literature awards system in the early 1900s and how that has drastically influenced the kinds of things that children read. And so if you want more full background about some of the early days of children's literature and the earliest things, you can look at some of my videos, the lectures in my children's literature playlist for that class. But for now, this video would be all you would need as a background for this class. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So basically just the short version, of children's literature is that, so children used to be thought of as just miniature adults. We're talking about, 1600s and before. Right? Like before the 1600s, children were considered to be just small versions of adults. So there wasn't literature or books or anything specifically made just for children besides just alphabet books and books intended to help them learn to read. And so the literacy of children at all was even a consideration or a concern because the parents and adults were concerned about the child's soul and their ability to read the Bible and pray and therefore get into heaven. And so this concern was motivated by, the high infant mortality rates and high childhood mortality rates more specifically. And so it wasn't uncommon for a family to lose at least one or more of their children before they came of age. And so it became a big burden on the parents to be able to make sure that their children were going to be saved and go to heaven. And they thought the way that they could do that, or they had to do that, is to be able to read the Bible and read the Lord's Prayer and recite the Bible. So there was this huge emphasis. You were talking about from the Renaissance on, the Renaissance, and then in the corresponding in America, the Puritan era in America. And there was this sort of concern with educating children to read so that they could read the Bible or read prayers or whatever have you and go to church and get saved so that if they died young, they would go to heaven. And so early children's books in the, 1600s, I say books, were just alphabet sheets with, the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. I actually have a screenshot. Let me see if I can show you that. One moment. Here we go. If you look on my screen, you should be able to see, this is called a horn book. And it was just a little, piece of wood with the alphabet on it and the Lord's Prayer. I won't go too much into detail about that, but that was, what books were for children. And they had other little pamphlets and things that had the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer and maybe a couple little poems or something. But children's literature as an industry specifically started in 1744 with John Newbery's Pretty Little Pocketbook. It was a little primer type book, just like a little pamphlet almost, just a little booklet. And it had, it came with a toy. And it was like a little ball. And so it was marketed, if you bought this for a boy, then it was a ball. But if you bought the book for a girl, it was a pincushion, which is a little bit sexist, but we don't have to get into that right now. So the field of children's literature as a a market as its own genre started in 1744 with John Newbery's Little Pretty Pocketbook. And so because it was the first text for children that was commercially produced. It was marketed to children. It was, it was addressed to them. There was a letter in the beginning, Dear Master Tommy, or Dear Master Susie, or something, whatever. And so, but it was still very much family literature, and, it was intended for families or children with their nannies or governesses or whomever to read it together. But 1744 was the start of children's literature as a genre, as a commercialized market. Texts were still very moral at that point. You still had the concern for the children's morality and well-being, but so, and Pretty Little Pocketbook was also one of the first departures away from spiritual or religious. It was still very moralistic, like be a good girl, listen to your parents, obey, eat good healthy foods, get exercise, that kind of thing. But it wasn't necessarily spiritual. Still very teachable, and in the children's lit world we call that didactic. The term didactic meaning preachy kind of is the connotation of that. So the Pretty Little Pocketbook and these books marketed to children were still very didactic and moralistic, but we were starting to move away from religious in some of our texts. So there were educational textbooks. The New England Primer was a big one. If you look at, if you've taken children's lit, we talk about that. And then a lot of colorful alphabet books and interesting alphabet books came after that. And that's kind of the early stuff. Our next big phase in the field of studying children and what children read was during the Romantic era. If you've had me in British Lit, we've talked about the Romantics, but if you haven't had British Lit, the Romantic era was the turn of the century from the late 1700s into the early 1800s. And that is the poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge and, those kind of guys. And so specifically Wordsworth had a poem about the innocence of childhood, and sort of it became this movement in the Romantic era of, picturing childhood as this time of innocent preservation that needed to be set aside, that needed to be protected, and it was this sort of innocent time from when you're born until you grow up. Your experiences need to be controlled and protected because you are being besmirched by the world, by your experiences in the world. They took a lot of these ideas from John Locke, the blank slate theory, where you're born with a blank slate and all of your experiences are written on there, and you can't unknow things and you can't unsee things. And so inspired by this blank slate theory, inspired by Wordsworth and his sort of vision of innocent childhood, this whole idea of the romantic child emerged at the beginning of the 1800s. So whereas children were previously thought of as little adults who were born into sin and needed to learn how to read right away so that they could go to heaven, then it became, children were born as precious, pure, innocent angels and needed to be protected and preserved for as long as possible. So that you can see what kind of a dramatic psychological and cultural shift that would cause. And the things that children were being taught and the things they were given to read adjusted as a result. So not long after the Romantic movement kind of developed this idea of this romantic child, this innocent child, is when we, in England especially, we had the Victorian era come through, which was this age of advancement, expanse, technological achievement, and really moving forward. The railroad and the steam engine and the telegraph and photography and all of this technological advancement happened in the Victorian era because of industrialization. And so what also happened was advances in publishing and printing techniques and things like that. And so not long after the Romantics, within a few decades, we emerged into what is known in children's scholarship as the Golden Age. The Golden Age of children's literature. And it starts in the mid-1800s. The official sort of kickoff that we consider as the Golden Age of children's literature is Alice in Wonderland in 1865. Because Alice in Wonderland is the first sort of widely commercially successful text written specifically for children. It had a child reader at its very core. Alice Little, who was the inspiration for Charles Dodgson, Lewis Carroll to write Alice in Wonderland. And it was not didactic, meaning it did not have a moral lesson to impart. It wasn't some educational, memorize this poem so you can memorize the alphabet kind of a thing. It wasn't a be a good little girl and do what you're supposed to do kind of a text. It was purely entertainment. And so the Golden Age and Alice sort of ushered in this era in children's literature of, hey guys, you know, it's okay to write things for children that they just want to read. You know, they enjoy reading it. They're not learning anything from it necessarily. If they do, it's a side effect. It's not the goal, right? And they maybe just can think it's funny or enjoy it, or there's a character they like. And this was kind of a novel idea. Like, what? You know, children might just want to sit down and read just because there doesn't have to be some edifying, lesson that comes out of it. And so that was another big shift in the way we think about writing for children and the activity of childhood reading. You know, it was a big shift in our thought processes as far as that goes, was the Golden Age. So out of the Golden Age, in England and America is where this was mainly happening. But we had, you know, Alice in Wonderland, like I said, we had things like, in America, we had Little Women, you know, Louise May Alcott's text. We had Mark Twain, who was writing Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. And we had Little House on the Prairie much later. We had Wizard of Oz. And you also had, out of the Golden Age, Peter Pan and Peter Rabbit and Winnie the Pooh and Mary Poppins and sort of all of these classic texts that we think of as the foundational elements and text classics of children's literature came out of this sort of boom of writing for children. And so that, you know, and technological advances also made it where picture books were able to be more prevalent and more easily made. And there were magazines for children. There was childhood Juvenile Miscellany was one of them. St. Nicholas Magazine. You know, some of these sort of periodicals that were produced just for children to read, and they had fun stories and poems and games and little plays that they could memorize and put on in their home or whatever. And so the field of commercialized publishing for children really boomed in the mid 1800s and on. It took kind of a, you know, I guess where it really sort of the Golden Age ends is in the World Wars, when the Great Depression, we had World War I, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II. That sort of ushered in a different sort of a era. The Golden Age was kind of a thing of the past. But one more thing I'll say about the Golden Age was that it was also very nostalgic, because something we think about, this is a good time to bring this part in, something we think about in the field of children's literature is children's literature is the one genre of literature where the audience is not the same as the author. So anytime you're analyzing literature, you have three things that you're thinking about, right? You have the author of the text, you have the content or subject of the text, and you have the audience or the intended audience of the text. And so children's literature is pretty much the only genre of literature where the creator, the author of the text, is not also assumed to be the audience of the text. With adults, you assume adults are writing it, adults are reading it. With, you know, this will come up in this class a lot too, with minority groups. You assume African Americans are writing the texts that are intended to be for African American audiences, and Jewish authors are writing the texts that are intended to be for Jewish audiences, things like that. But we don't have very many examples where children are writing children's literature. There are some famous examples, like S.E. Hinton was only 15, I think, when she published The Outsiders. Christopher Paolini was 15 when he wrote Eragon, when he started the Eragon series. There's some examples like that, where there's young people, and there are picture books where the kid would write it and the adult would illustrate it, or vice versa. The kid would make the drawings and the adult would write a story to go with it. So there are examples of children, and in children's literature, in the academic field, children's literature is anything 18 years and under. 18 and under is children's literature. So that's why we now separate it into YA. So we have to think about who was writing these texts and who was reading these texts. So the Golden Age sort of introduced us to this conundrum where you have adults who are producing the literature for a different audience, for a non-adult audience. And so at first you think, well, that's not a big deal. Every adult, without exception, was a child at some point. So they are just writing about the past. But however, they're writing through a retrospective lens, right? So an adult writing a text intended for children to read, and many times featuring child characters, is written with that lens of experience and that lens of nostalgia. So you have an adult, for the example, J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. You have an adult man who is nostalgically looking back on boyhood and childhood, and there's a little bit of a melancholy sense of loss there. You might see the same kind of a thing in Alice in Wonderland, where you have Charles Dodson and an adult man who's looking back on childhood and the challenges of navigating the confusing world as a child, and sort of looking back with cynicism and maybe a little bit of melancholy as well. We have the same in Wizard of Oz. I mean, there's all these examples of adult authors who are representing this sort of idyllic, non-realistic, idealized representation of what it's like to be a child. And the child protagonists that adults create, especially during the Golden Age, were usually pretty precocious, independent. They had sort of this world experience and knowledge that they shouldn't have. They responded more like adults would respond rather than how a realistic child would respond. And I don't know that that's even stopped. I don't know that we've gotten even away from that with adults who are writing child protagonists and sort of imbuing their own life experience and nostalgia into the voice of that child character. So that's something that's, when the Golden Age emerged, that was something that really became clear as scholars went back and started reading these texts and sort of looking at some of the themes. So before I talk about the awards, I do want to talk about, after the Golden Age, we didn't stop making children's lit. It just changed a little bit. We had, after World War II, the teen culture emerged. And so the concept of young adult, the concept of adolescence, really didn't come about until the turn of the century. It's a fairly new idea, this sort of middle period of adolescence between childhood and adulthood. The word teenager was first used in 1944 in Seventeen magazine, but it didn't really become part of the national parlance, if you will, until much later. But so the culture of the 1950s with the sock hops and the park, the drive-ins and the soda jerks and things like that, Mickey Rooney and James Dean and all that. That was when teen culture really emerged. So the literature after that reflected sort of the emergence of older children, right? Still culturally who were children, but who had cars and part-time jobs, and they had expendable income, and public high school just kind of became a thing in the late 1930s. And so that was a whole new culture of young people that emerged. And when we get to those texts, if we read texts for teenagers and a little bit older things, we could talk about this more about adolescence and sort of its influence on modern culture. But just know that was kind of the next phase that people were starting to write for older children as well, after the World Wars, after the turn of the century, the Golden Age was over. And then I think the last big phase, I guess you will, of children's lit that we're still in is the fantasy phase, where people started writing, and this probably started in the you might could go back as early as like The Hobbit in 1937, but that was kind of a fluke. It was ahead of its time. The Narnia series in the 1950s, again, was kind of ahead of its time. It really started, though, in, I would say, like the 70s. 70s and 80s is when fantasy series for young people really sort of took off. Because you had a lot more options and a lot more examples after the sort of earlier experiments of the Inklings with Tolkien, Lewis and Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. But you had, I would say, then commercially, it really got going with Harry Potter. You know, when Harry Potter started coming out in the 90s, you know, that's when the commercial fantasy literature for young people really got going. So for younger readers, that's kind of the most recent big phase was like magical fantasy type. And then for teens, you know, we emerged with YA, right? A whole separate genre. So we have kind of separated children's lit into a couple of genres. We have and it's all based on commercial sales. Like it's not an academic distinction. It's not a psychological distinction. It's a money thing. So I wanted to kind of make that clear. You know, the distinctions of genre we have now with early readers, and we have middle readers, and we have YA, and we have all this different stuff. Those are commodified commercial genres that have emerged from the publishing world. But YA, I would say, as a genre started maybe its sort of precursors of where it was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where you had this sort of emergence of what people call issues books, where you had books about abortion and like teenage abortion and pregnancy, and you had books about people going out and drinking, and you had books about doing drugs and things like that. And it was this very reactionary set of literature in the late 1960s, early 1970s, from adults who were panicking that their babies were drinking and doing drugs and getting pregnant and all this stuff, from like the whole hippie free love movement of the 60s. But those were replaced by the after school special in the 80s, you know, the TV on TV. And so the sentiment was still there. It was just, it took a different form from books. But then I would say in the 80s and really going into the 90s is when we had sort of teen lit, or YA, that emerged as its own separate genre of books, usually set in high school or on summer break from high school, something to do with high school. There's a whole genre of books set with high school kids, and it was like a whole, and still it's a thing. You know, there's it might be a magical school, or it might be a school for creatures, or it might be, you know, something interesting like that. But it's school aged, specifically high school aged characters, and the things that they deal with, and the problems that they have, and the things they think about with growing up, and what have you. So that's sort of the most recent genre. So as an academic field, children's literature, as you know, what I do, you know, having a degree in it, publishing articles in it, studying it in a scholarly way, it started going in the, you know, late 60s, early 70s. People started kind of noticing, wishing it was there. But children's literature scholarship as a field officially started in 1973 with the establishment of the Children's Literature Association, which is an official professional association. It's still in existence today. I'm a member of it. I've gone to the conference every year, and they have a gathering every summer where we present papers and scholarship and meet and have awards and all kind of stuff. And so it's a thriving field of scholarship now, but it emerged in the early 1970s out of this sort of resentment for, you know, you can pretty much study any literature now in higher education. You can study deeply disturbing psychological texts. You can read about sexual deviance. You can read about criminals and murder and all kind of stuff. You can study them and publish about them. But if you tried to publish or do scholarship on books written for children, it was dismissed as not sophisticated enough. It was derogatorily called kitty lit, right? The kitty lit. Oh, you just do kitty lit, right? That's something, if you're studying to be an elementary school teacher, maybe you study kitty lit, and that's an appropriate thing. But the idea in the 70s emerged of studying children's literature as an adult scholar. Not because you're trying to teach it to children, not because you're wanting to be a teacher and you're trying to see what your kids should read, but as an adult scholar, completely unrelated to children at all in your career, you want to study children's literature as legitimate literature of its own. And so it kind of wasn't respected at first. It wasn't, something that was like, yeah, that, we need to be studying that. Like, no, we're going to stick to Shakespeare and the Romantics and Dickens, and that's the real literature. You can keep your kitty lit, right? But it eventually gained traction, and so now children's literature has many universities have programs where you can major in children's literature. I got my PhD in children's and young adult literature. It's much more of a respected scholarship field, and completely set apart from educational scholarship. This, children's literature is not studying children's literature as how to teach it and its merit in the classroom. It's studying it as art and its merit as literature, right, on its own. But we can't study it that way without thinking about the intended child audience as well. So children do have to come in to the consideration when we're doing children's literature. But I wanted to sort of explain that in the last several decades, since the 70s, we have now legitimate adult scholarship that has nothing to do with relating the text to child readers. It's looking at it as art. So I wanted to kind of make that clear. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the awards system. So, one of the big things in children's lit, the field, is what texts get recognized, what texts get attention, and which ones don't. So, this happens in a couple ways. Books that win awards, or books that are banned. Right? Banned books are usually children's books, banned because they're supposed to be for children and they're not appropriate. Right? So you have awards books and you have banned books. And for both of these categories, the gatekeepers, the grand gatekeepers of children's literature are librarians. Right? The ALA, the American Library Association, they are responsible for awarding most of the major children's literature awards. There are some exceptions, but librarians are the sort of gatekeepers of what gets attention in children's literature. So books that win these major awards, that's what's going to be featured prominently in their library. That's what's going to be sent to school classrooms. When teachers aren't really sure what new books to get, they're going to look at what's won the awards lately and they'll get those. And then the other books that get attention are the ones that are challenged or banned for some reason, like the controversial content or, bad words or whatever. And those books also get attention. So what you don't want as a children's literature author is to be somewhere in the middle where you're not controversial, but you didn't win any awards either. That's like a death sentence. You're not going to get very much attention in the middle. But I'm not trying to criticize librarians either. By the way, my best friend is a children's librarian, and so I respect that field very much. But it's just kind of funny that librarians really do have a lot of power in our field, in our industry, because of the awards they give out and what they decide to feature on a shelf and on a display. And so the children's librarians, which grew out of even before that in the 1800s, the newly emerging idea of Sunday school, and like what, the school for children to come on the weekends and learn to read. That's what Sunday school used to be, was a literacy program before it was a moral education, spiritual program. So anyway, there's some other history there we don't need to go into, but all that's being said is that what I'm trying to say is that the awards that are given out every year are highly influential. So I wanted to kind of break down and kind of go through what those are. So the earliest one, I have a list here. The earliest one is the Newbery Award. I mentioned John Newbery a little bit earlier. He started children's literature with the Little Pretty Pocketbook, and so the award, the first ever literature award for children's literature, excellence in children's literature, was established by the ALA, the American Library Association, in 1922, and they named it in honor of John Newbery. And so you'll see the Newbery Award. Oh, whoops! I just kicked my thing. You'll see it on things. I have an example here. You'll see the gold seal on a book if you've read Holes. That was a popular book, so I picked it. But you'll see this gold seal with the little, and it says the John Newbery Award. It has an open book on it for the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. So this is specifically an American award. And many of the major awards are in America. That's just, we're number one. I don't know, but that's just something America has really, because the Children's Literature Association was founded here in Connecticut. So children's literature scholarship is most concentrated in America. That's why a lot of the awards are here. So the Newbery, if you win a Newbery, or not every year they declare a winner and then some runners up, like honor books. If you see a Newbery honor, the seal will be silver. But getting a gold seal or a silver seal on your book is highly coveted, right? To get a seal, and you're more likely, you're guaranteed to have good sales. You're guaranteed to maybe get a movie made out of your book. You're guaranteed, if you're an author, to get more books in your contract to be able to write. And so that Newbery Award is very prestigious. But it's not the only one. For for illustration, so the Newbery is for fiction, but for the comparable one for a picture book is the Caldecott medal. So the gold seal that you see on picture books is the Caldecott, and if it's an honor book or a runner-up, it'll be a silver seal, just like with Newbery. Well, the Caldecott medal is actually named after an illustrator who, was one of the early pioneers of illustrations for children's books and picture books. And so again, it was instituted in 1938, the Caldecott was, but Caldecott himself was from the late 17, early 1800. He was from before, kind of like Newbery. But the award was named in his honor. So you have the Newbery and the Caldecott. Those are our two biggest awards in children's literature. So for picture books, if you've got that gold or silver seal, you just automatically think, oh, this must be pretty good, right? Even parents are like that. Librarians are like that. Everybody's like, oh, this is probably a safe bet. It's going to be a good book. And so the Newbery and the Caldecott are our big, awards. We also have in 1950, they established the National Jewish Book Award. I have one here that won the National Jewish Book Award, which you can kind of guess it's for excellence in books by Jewish authors or about Jewish subjects. So that's it's not as major of an award, but it was the next one that we had established. And then we have the, let's see. What's the next one? Oh, yes. In 1967, I don't have any books for this because they don't put a seal on theirs, but we have the Horn Book. So if you've ever heard, I showed you images of what a horn book used to be. Well, there was the Horn Book magazine was established, and it was established, I'm not sure when the magazine was established, but the award was established in 1967. But they were giving out the Horn Book. It's still a magazine where they review and suggest and have top lists of children's and young adult books. And that's what they're mainly known for, is a book review magazine for young people's literature. And so they have an award too. So the Horn Book Award is also very prestigious, but they don't put a sticker on the book, so I don't have any of those to show you. The next one is, it's kind of interesting. So in 1970, the Coretta Scott King Award was instituted for, it's kind of like the Newbery for African American literature. So the idea was to, and especially poignant for this class, the idea was to recognize more diverse titles in children's literature. The Jewish Book Award was kind of doing that for Jewish literature. But the Coretta Scott King Award was instituted after the Civil Rights Movement in 1970. And it was meant to recognize achievement specifically in texts by African Americans or about African Americans. And so I have one here. I have Jacqueline Woodson's very good poetic biography called Brown Girl Dreaming. It's a biography, autobiography. It's her autobiography in poem form, in a series of poems. It won all kinds of awards. You can see it has this is the Coretta Scott King winner logo. It was a Newbery honor. That's a silver Newbery. And then it was I haven't talked about the National Book Award yet. But it was a winner for the National Book Award for young people's literature as well. And so this book has all kinds of stickers on it, but this is the seal for the Coretta Scott King. So the Coretta Scott King Award is kind of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, that's great. We need to have more awards and we need to have more recognition for minority literature, specifically African American was what this one was for. On the other hand, it kind of had the opposite intended effect, and still does, where it kind of ghettoizes the award field. So if there's a really good book like this one, this is an exception where it got multiple awards, but if there's a really good book, African American book, that comes out, the idea in the award committee's mind is, well, that one was probably a shoo-in for the Coretta Scott King Award, so we'll give the Newbery to somebody else to kind of play spread it out, right? And so you end up having the Newbery, which is the main award from, like, the oldest award we have. The Newbery tends to then to go toward more mainstream and majority ethnicity texts, and then they reserve their awarding to the minority text to the awards for that minority. Right? You have the Coretta Scott King Award, the National Jewish Book Award. We also have, I'll show you, in 1996 they established, which you're reading for this class, the Pura Belpré Award, which is for Hispanic American literature. We're reading Esperanza Rising in this class, so it's a winner of the Pura Belpré, which is again for Hispanic. So if you have a really good Hispanic children's book, the idea is it'll get the Pura Belpré. We'll give the Newbery to somebody else, and so just spread around the love, so to speak. So these awards have kind of had the effect where they award minority texts, but then they'll also sort of ghettoize the awards where you're a Hispanic book, you get the Pura Belpré. You're an African American book, you get the Coretta Scott King, and then we'll give the main people the Newbery award. So it's kind of, it's a little bit, we can talk more about this in class as we read these texts if you'd like. But I wanted to kind of point that out. In 1985, an interesting book, the Children's Literature Association established the Phoenix Award. Here's a book with the Phoenix Award sticker on it. And the Phoenix Award is given, there's 2 of them every year. There's one for fiction, there's 3. There's fiction, nonfiction, and then an illustrated book, a picture book. So the Phoenix Award is given to any book that is 20 years old and didn't win any awards when it came out. So hence the name Phoenix, where it's like it rises from the ashes. It has like a second life, right? So the Phoenix Award Committee every year in the Children's Literature Association goes 20 years back from that year, goes 20 years in the past and looks at all the books published 20 years ago and then picks winners from that. And a lot of times these authors are like, what? Like it just kind of catches them off guard. Like, I wrote that book ages ago and it didn't get any awards back then. So I really kind of, the Phoenix Award is very entertaining to me for that reason, you know, because a lot of times the authors, and they'll come to CHL, like this one, it's a sister group, and the illustrator, Jacqueline Price Weitzman, who wrote, sorry, that was the author. Robin Price Glasser is the illustrator. She wrote, she illustrated Fancy Nancy. That's what she's mostly known for, is Fancy Nancy, but this is one of their earlier ones. And she and her sister, who wrote this book, came to the, CHLA. They came to the conference because we were honoring their book, and they're like, how cool! And I happened to be presenting a paper about this book at the conference, and so they, signed my book and you know, just gushed and gushed and took pictures with me because I presented a scholarly paper about their book, and they were like thrilled with it. So this is one of the Phoenix books I have, and it's the coolest one I've got, because of that. But yeah, that's what the Phoenix Award is, and it's been going on for, since the 80s. There's a couple more I wanted to mention. The National Book Award has been around for ages, decades and decades, since like the 50s or something. But the National Book Award category for young people's literature was only established in 1996, I think. Yeah. So one of the books we're reading won that. We're not reading Brown Girl Dreaming, but we're reading The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and it was a National Book Award for young people's literature. There's, other things we're reading have that too, but I grabbed this one because I had a copy of it. So that was a winner of the National Book Award for young people's literature that was established in 1996. The last award I want to mention is the Printz Award, Printz, named after a guy whose last name was Prince. And it was established in 1999, and it is the premier award for teen literature, for books specifically for teens. One of the books we're reading, American Born Chinese, has that gold, try to show it in the camera, the gold P, on the cover. Other famous winners, Walter Dean Meyer's Monster was a winner. John Green's first book, Looking for Alaska, won the Printz Award in 2005 or 6, I think. American Born Chinese won the very next year, and made it where John Green's next book, An Abundance of Catherines, was the runner-up. It has the silver P on it. So, the Printz Award, it's not that old. It's only been like 20 years or so that they've been giving out the Printz Award to teen literature. But it has established itself as sort of the premier award for highly artistic and thoughtful and meaningful books for teens. So if you wanted to go back, you can look at the previous winners of the Printz Award. Let's see. So I wanted to just kind of give you an example of those kinds of awards that come out every year, because a lot of times it will make or break an author. It will make or break the success of a book, and it will determine what children are learning in school, because these awards and the librarians that are responsible for giving them out are kind of like I said before, the gatekeepers of what gets read by children, right? And so a lot of times parents and even teachers don't have time to filter through all of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books for children a year that are published, and so they rely on these as kind of a shortcut to let them know what they should be teaching and what their kids should be reading. And so it is sort of this responsibility every year for librarians to sort of determine these awards and to feature them. But it is concerning, I guess, because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books every year published for children, and we only have a handful every year that kind of get on the radar. So, maybe that's a good thing. We can kind of filter out a lot of the low quality stuff that's put out there just as a money grab, but there's probably some diamonds in the rough that don't ever get recognized. So maybe hopefully the Phoenix Award picks them up much later. So, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know if it's, it's good or bad, but I just wanted to put it out there as sort of that's what's, a big determining factor in what we study and what we read. Okay, so this has been about 45 minutes, which has been about how much I would lecture in class, I guess. So, mainly this first lecture I wanted to give you a crash course in the history of children's literature and as a field and as a commercial industry and as an academic field, and some of these awards that have been given out for starting about 100 years ago. The award system in children's lit really sort of changed how things are published and how we decide what to read and what children read. So we can talk more about this in class if you have questions. But other than that, this is all I have to say. So I will, my next video, we'll be talking more specifically about different kinds of minorities and the kinds of minorities we'll be talking about in this class and different considerations to think of as far as representations for those minorities. So that'll be the next video. But until then, you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you later.